The road stretching out of the ruined Ruhr pocket looked less like a path and more like a scar across the land, carved by weeks of fire and bombardment. Dust clung to every surface. The broken houses, the collapsed barns, the smashed railway lines, and the boots of the prisoners trudging across it. Among those prisoners walked a line of German generals, men once feared across Europe, now reduced to figures limping beneath a grey May sky that did not care what ranks shimmered on their shoulders. Most were in their late 40s or 50s, with one or two older men leaning heavily on makeshift canes fashioned from snap table legs scavenged from the wreckage. They moved quietly, their silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of American jeeps escorting them toward a destination none dared ask about. Some of the generals still wore fragments of their old world, a torn cuff with a faded eagle, a crushed visor cap held together by stubborn pride, a medal pinned to a tunic that smelled of mud and smoke. Yet even these tokens felt like relics from another lifetime. Their eyes, hollow from sleepless nights, swollen from wind and soot, betrayed what they all believed. The march was taking them not to a camp, but to their deaths. There was no logic to hope. The Third Reich had crumbled completely. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The West had seen the concentration camp. What mercy could possibly remain? General Erich Forster, a tall, gaunt man of 58, walked near the front of the column, each step sending a sharp jolt through an untreated shrapnel wound in his thigh. He'd spent years plotting armored maneuvers on sweeping maps, imagining himself modern and untouchable. Now, he strained to keep upright while an American military policeman, no older than 20, guided the column with the casual posture of someone who had already survived far worse than a group of defeated officers. Forster had been raised on the Prussian notion that surrender was a disgrace, yet here he was, dragging one foot slightly behind the other, feeling the weight of a war he no longer understood. He fully expected a trial if he was lucky. More likely, he thought, a field execution. His generation had grown up believing the world would always bend to German will. It was a bitter revelation to watch that belief die in real time. Behind him, General Klaus Reinhardt, 5 years younger and bitterly observant, muttered under his breath about propaganda. Goebbels said the Americans would string us up on the first tree. He rasped, voice cracking from dehydration. He said they shoot officers on sight. No mercy for the commanders of the Reich, he warned. The words were not angry, they were tired. He wasn't sure whether he had believed Nazi propaganda because it was convenient or because, after 6 years of war, truth and lies had begun to blur into the same dull hue. Reinhardt's companion, the older General Ludwig Merz, responded without turning his head. Perhaps Goebbels believed his own stories, he said softly. That is always the worst kind of storyteller. Then he tightened his coat against the cold wind and resumed walking, forcing a steady rhythm into his aching knees. He, too, believed no mercy awaited them. But unlike the others, he felt strangely calm about it. After the bombings, the massacres, the front dissolutions, and the impossible orders from Berlin, death no longer frightened him. What frightened him more was the thought of being kept alive long enough to confront everything he had obeyed. The American convoy guiding them moved with a strict but unbothered discipline. The guards didn't sneer, didn't shout, didn't strike. They simply motioned the prisoners forward when the line slowed. This calmness unsettled the generals more than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have made sense. Indifference was a mystery. It suggested the Americans did not see them as monsters or trophies. They saw them as paperwork, responsibilities, cargo to be moved from point A to point B. The realization bruised their pride more sharply than threats ever could. As the column rounded a bend, the full devastation of the Ruhr became visible. Smoke drifted lazily from the ruins of steel mills that had once fueled the Wehrmacht. Bridges lay in rivers like bones. A locomotive sat on its side, wheels bent at unnatural angles. A cracked church bell hung frozen mid-fall. Forster paused for a moment, taking in the scene. 6 months earlier, he had argued to continue the war, insisting Germany still had a chance. Now, staring at the shattered skeletons of cities, he wondered whether he had been loyal or delusional. Perhaps both. Their march lasted hours. When the convoy finally slowed, the generals braced themselves. Ahead lay a fortified compound encircled by barbed wire and wooden guard towers, the American flag fluttering in the wind. Some of the generals stiffened instinctively. "This is it," Reinhardt whispered. Processing before execution. No one contradicted him. The guards instructed them to halt, then began directing them toward the gates. To the officers' growing confusion, the Americans neither unholstered weapons nor tightened their formation. Instead, a medical jeep rolled forward, parking beside the gate. 2 medics stepped out, one carrying a clipboard, the other holding a water canteen. They approached the line briskly, scanning faces not for guilt, but for signs of injury. The younger medic's expression was clinical, almost bored, as he pointed at Merz's limp and murmured something to the other soldier, who immediately knelt to inspect the general's swollen ankle. The generals exchanged stunned glances. Forster felt a flicker of something he couldn't name, relief, maybe. Or disorientation. Or humiliation. Reinhardt stared at the medics as though witnessing a hallucination. "What game is this?" he muttered. He had expected shackles, interrogation, spit in the face. Not medical attention. Not hydration. Not this bizarre routine of humane procedure. One American corporal moved down the line handing out small paper cups of water. When he offered one to Forster, the general hesitated, waiting for some trick. The corporal simply shrugged. "It's water, sir," he said, neutrality hiding any judgment. The "sir" struck Forster like a slap. Respect? Courtesy? Toward him? He took the cup with stiff fingers, uncertain whether to drink or apologize. Inside the gates, the camp was organized with precise American efficiency. Tents arranged in neat rows, supply trucks weaving through narrow pathways, everything marked with signs, numbers, and instructions. It had an order that contrasted violently with the general's expectations of chaos or punishment. They were directed toward a wooden table where a medical officer waited with forms. Forster caught fragments of English. Record injuries, immunization, treatment queue. He felt as though he had stepped into another universe, one governed by rules instead of revenge. As they were lined up for medical intake, the realization began to sink in. The Americans were not preparing to shoot them. They were preparing to examine them, to treat them, to keep them alive. The truth came slowly, hesitantly, because it conflicted with everything they had been told. The propaganda had promised cruelty. Reality offered indifference and protocol. And that contrast unsettled them more deeply than fear. Merz watched a medic apply disinfectant to a young sergeant's scraped knuckles, then glanced at Reinhardt. "If they meant to kill us," he murmured, "why waste supplies on the wounded?" Reinhardt didn't answer. He looked around, his mind racing through possibilities. Interrogation camps, intelligence extraction, diplomatic displays. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the simple, unceremonious routine unfolding before them. Forster, still clutching the empty water cup, felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. He had accepted death as imminent. Now, he found himself facing something far more complicated, survival offered by the very enemy he had been trained to despise. The contradiction gnawed at him, loosening convictions he had once believed unbreakable. A breeze swept across the compound, carrying the scent of antiseptic and fresh wood from newly built structures. For a moment, the sounds of the camp, voices, footsteps, rustling papers, felt strangely peaceful. Disorienting, but peaceful. Then came a new order from the American officer in charge, delivered with crisp authority. "Bring them to medical evaluation. We start with the high-ranking ones." The generals exchanged looks. High-ranking ones. First in line. Not for execution, but for treatment. For documentation. For some purpose that remained hidden. And as the medics motioned them forward, a single question rose among them, a question heavier than fear, sharper than guilt, and more unsettling than surrender. If the enemy was not here to punish them, then what exactly awaited them inside those sterile tents, and why did it feel far more threatening than a bullet? The camp gates closed behind the generals with a metallic thud that echoed through the compound like a verdict. Yet the air inside felt strangely ordinary, too ordinary for men who had expected to meet a firing squad. Instead of interrogation rooms and gallows, they found rows of tents, a few Red Cross crates, and a cluster of American medics walking briskly between stations with clipboards tucked under their arms. The transition from dread to bewilderment happened so quickly that several generals stood frozen, trying to interpret what this unexpected civility meant. General Forster felt a tug at his sleeve as an American sergeant motioned him toward a long wooden table under a canvas canopy. The table was arranged with neat stacks of paper, pencils sharpened to identical points, a portable lamp, and a metal box marked medical priority. A young military doctor with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from the paperwork and gestured for Forster to sit. "Name, rank, date of birth," he said, not harshly, not kindly, simply as a matter of routine. Forster blinked, unsure how to respond. He had prepared his mind for accusations, threats, humiliation. But this bureaucratic politeness, felt more dangerous in its unfamiliarity. He answered the questions slowly, glancing around as if expecting the real interrogation to arrive at any moment. The doctor barely looked at him while recording details. When he finally raised his eyes, it was only to ask, "Any injuries?" The question was so ordinary, so unthreatening, that Forster felt a flicker of embarrassment. Injuries? He had led thousands of men into battle. He had watched entire towns burn. The idea that the Americans wanted to inspect his wounds felt absurd, almost insulting. "I took shrapnel in the thigh a month ago," he muttered. "It is manageable." The doctor gave a curt nod. "We'll take a look. Infection is common among POWs this month. Sit tight." And with that, he moved on to the next general as if Forster were no different from the hundreds of prisoners processed before him. Nearby, General Merz observed the scene with a sharp, analytical gaze. His experience in military administration had conditioned him to evaluate systems, and what he saw here unsettled him more than hostility would have. The Americans were efficient, predictable. They treated each German officer with the same detached professionalism, as though the war's brutality existed somewhere far outside this small grid of tents. A younger German officer in line murmured nervously, "What do you think they're doing?" Merz answered without looking at him. "Their job, apparently. And that is what frightens me." General Reinhardt, meanwhile, sat on a folding chair in the shade while a medic examined his hands for frostbite. Reinhardt had spent years believing American soldiers were crude, undisciplined, eager for vengeance. Goebbels' propaganda had painted them as animals wrapped in uniforms. Now he found himself being spoken to by a sergeant who treated him like an inconvenient but harmless chore. "You've lost quite a bit of circulation in the fingers," the medic noted. "We'll get you some ointment." Reinhardt almost wanted to laugh. Ointment. For a man who had once commanded artillery divisions. Instead, he forced out a tight question. "Why are you doing this?" The medic glanced up, confused. "Because it's protocol, sir." That single word, protocol, landed heavier than any accusation. Protocol was the language of a system functioning correctly, of rules applied without emotion. The Americans weren't offering kindness. They were following regulations. The Geneva Convention, signed 16 years earlier, now stood between the generals and whatever punishments they imagined. A thin legal document had proven more powerful than their regime's collapse. As the hours passed, each general was moved through stations like passengers on a strange conveyor belt. One tent for wounds, another for vaccinations, where an army nurse administered injections with practiced speed. A third for dental checks, where Merz discovered that one of his molars, ignored for months, had finally cracked. He disliked the idea of being vulnerable under an enemy's care, but the American dentist's steady hands and matter-of-fact voice left him with no opportunity for resentment. The absurdity only grew when he overheard the dentist muttering, "Should have taken better care of this while you had the chance." The comment wasn't mocking. It was an ordinary complaint, the kind a dentist might express to any neglectful patient. By mid-afternoon, the generals had grown more confused than frightened. Everything was too calm, too organized. The threat they expected had not materialized, replaced instead by standardized procedures. They had braced for punishment. Instead they were catalogued like livestock. And yet, beneath the civility, a deeper disquiet was spreading, one rooted in the collapse of assumptions forged by years of propaganda. While Forster waited for his turn at the surgical tent, he noticed something curious. The Americans weren't armed heavily. Some carried pistols. A few had rifles slung casually over their shoulders. But no one seemed tense. No one paced or scowled or barked threat. The guards spoke among themselves about mail deliveries, baseball scores, and the taste of powdered coffee. The war, for them, was already fading into routine. For the Germans, it was still ending. Reinhardt sat on a bench beside him, rubbing the bandaged tips of his fingers. "They are not afraid of us," he murmured. "Not even wary." Forster nodded. To them we are no danger. That is the humiliation. It is also the truth, Mers added quietly as he joined them. We are defeated men. They know it before we do. Across the yard, an American lieutenant was supervising the distribution of basic rations. Each German officer received a tin of soup, a piece of bread, and a small packet of powdered vitamins. One of the younger generals hesitated, unsure whether to eat. The lieutenant noticed and raised an eyebrow. It's food, gentlemen. War's over. Eat. Something in the lieutenant's tone, casual, dismissive, faintly amused, carried the message that the Americans had nothing to fear from their former enemies. That reality, more than hunger or fatigue, hollowed the German officers from within. Forster ate slowly, tasting every mouthful with the uneasy awareness that this meal had been provided by the very nation he had spent years fighting. Reinhardt barely ate at all, too preoccupied with the implications of their treatment. If they wanted revenge, they would have taken it already, he muttered. If they wanted information, they would be questioning us. So why this? Mers folded his hands. Because their strength is not in cruelty. Their power comes from order. That is what we failed to understand. Forster felt the sting of the remark, but did not contradict it. As evening approached, the generals were escorted to a rectangular wooden barrack. Inside, there were rows of cots, each neatly arranged with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. A faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. No chains. No isolation cells. No punishments displayed as warnings. The subtlety of the environment was more unsettling than open aggression. It implied longevity. It implied they would be here a while. An American officer entered carrying a clipboard and a lantern. Listen up, he said. You'll be staying here for the night. Lights out at 2200. Medical follow-ups in the morning. Any questions? None of the generals spoke. Their silence wasn't obedience. It was stunned incomprehension. The officer nodded and left. Once the door closed, the room filled with a muted hum of thought. Some generals sat on their cots rigidly. Others loosened their boots for the first time in days. No one slept yet. The uncertainty hovered like a fog. Finally, Mers broke the silence. This treatment, it is unsettling because it forces us to rethink everything. Reinhardt stared at the lantern's wavering light. If the enemy shows humanity, he whispered, what does that make us? Forster felt the question pierce something deep inside. He had expected fear to dominate this day. Instead, a more dangerous emotion had arrived, reflection. Outside, a distant truck engine rumbled, followed by footsteps approaching their barrack. Forster stiffened, expecting the long-awaited interrogation at last. But the door opened just enough for an American medic to step in and speak calmly. Tomorrow morning, he said, checking names against a list, we begin your medical treatment plan. Priority cases first. Then he added something that froze the room more effectively than any threat could have. Some of you will require surgery. He closed the door behind him, leaving the generals staring at each other in a silence so heavy it felt almost physical, each man wondering what other unexpected realities awaited them just beyond the next sunrise. The morning began not with gunfire or interrogation, but with the steady rhythm of footsteps and the faint rattle of metal trays. When the barracks door opened, pale sunlight spilled in, revealing an American orderly carrying a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. His voice was brisk but not unkind as he read off names, directing the generals toward the medical tents. The officers rose stiffly, exchanging uncertain glances. Every new minute in this camp seemed determined to contradict the one before it. General Forster walked at the front of the small group, his injured thigh throbbing with each step. He expected the surgeons to be stern, perhaps quietly resentful. Instead, the surgical tent was filled with a calm efficiency that felt almost surgical in itself. Sterile tables, trays of polished instruments, folded towels, and medics working with the precision of factory workers. A major from the U.S. Army Medical Corps greeted Forster with a short nod. Let's take a look at that leg. If shrapnel is still inside, we'll remove it today. The matter-of-fact tone startled him. Surgery? Today? Performed by the enemy? He sat down, his back straight, trying not to reveal the anxiety blooming in his stomach. As the doctor examined the wound, Forster realized the man wasn't studying a defeated general. He was studying a patient. The realization carried a weight he could not name. When the doctor asked, "You feeling dizzy? Any fever?" Forster found himself answering honestly, as though instinctively responding to authority that no longer depended on rank. A few tents away, Reinhardt watched as an American nurse wrapped new bandages around his frostbitten fingers. Her movements were brisk, and her expression was gently annoyed, not at him, but at the condition of his hands. "You didn't treat this for weeks," she said. "You're lucky we got to it in time." Reinhardt felt heat crawl up his face. Lucky. The enemy was calling him lucky. The irony was almost painful. He stared at the clean bandages, unsettled by the subtle intimacy of care. It forced him to recognize a truth he had avoided. Compassion, when unexpected, could feel like judgment. General Mers, meanwhile, was directed to a tent marked with a red cross painted hastily on canvas. Inside were rows of cots filled with German soldiers, privates, corporals, sergeants, each receiving some form of treatment. Some were being stitched up, others lay hooked to 4 bottles filled with saline solution. A medic placed a chart in Mers's hands. "You were listed as having a cracked molar. Dental station is 2 tents down." He pointed casually, as though giving directions to a visitor rather than a defeated adversary. Mers paused, absorbing the scene. The Americans treated their former enemies with the same procedural consistency they applied to everything else. There were no exceptions based on rank, reputation, or history. It was order, pure and unembellished, an order that, paradoxically, felt more powerful than violence. As he moved toward the dental tent, Mers couldn't shake the feeling that the American's restraint was exposing something within himself he had never examined closely. A growing awareness of how deeply the ideology he had served had distorted his understanding of power. The day unfolded in cycles of examinations, treatments, and quiet conversations. At mealtime, the generals received ration tins identical to those given to ordinary POWs. The food was simple, soup, bread, beans, but warm. As Forster sat beneath a makeshift awning, eating slowly, he watched the camp move with a rhythm that was almost domestic. Trucks delivered supplies. Medics logged reports. Guards smoked cigarettes while chatting about baseball players whose names meant nothing to the Germans. It felt like a small world operating under rules that no longer required hostility. Reinhardt joined Forster at the table, holding his bandaged hands away from the tin so he wouldn't stain the cloth strip. "I never imagined the enemy would show such." He searched for a word, frowning. "Structure." Forster exhaled quietly. "Structure can be a form of power." "And mercy?" Reinhardt asked. The question lingered between them like smoke. Later, as dusk settled across the camp, Mers walked along the fence line. Beyond the wire was a stretch of open Bavarian countryside, rolling hills, distant farmhouses, a sky turning violet with evening light. It looked peaceful, untouched by war, a landscape that had no reason to remember the men now confined behind the wire. He wondered what the Americans saw when they looked at them. War criminals? Officers? Victims of their own system? Or merely responsibilities to be processed humanely? When he returned to the barracks, the air inside felt different, less tense, more contemplative. Men were speaking in low voices, sharing fragments of disbelief. One officer recounted how an American medic had spent 15 minutes adjusting his splint to reduce pain. Another described being offered aspirin for a headache. These were small gestures, trivial even. But together they created a pressure that none of the generals had anticipated, the pressure to re-evaluate themselves. Forster lay on his cot, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the murmurs around him. His surgery was his newly dressed fingers and studied them with a quiet disbelief, realizing how strange it felt to have the enemy care whether he lost them. Mers stood near the window, watching the guards prepare the morning lists, and sensed that something fundamental within him had shifted, something that could not be undone by rank, loyalty, or memory. When the lieutenant returned to announce the transfers, his voice carried no threat, only purpose, and that neutrality felt heavier than anger. Several names were read, including Mers's, and a ripple of unease passed through the room as the chosen men gathered their belongings, uncertain whether they were being rewarded, relocated, or quietly removed from sight. The walk to the transport trucks felt different from the march that had brought them to the camp. This time there was no expectation of death, only the unnerving possibility of understanding. Forster noticed how quiet the Americans were, how little triumph they displayed, and it struck him that victory delivered without cruelty demanded a courage he had never considered. The trucks rolled southward along a road lined with spring blossoms, the landscape painfully gentle for men who had spent years navigating front lines soaked in fear and ambition. Reinhardt watched the fields drift past and felt something loosening inside him, a thread pulled free from a tapestry he had once believed unterrible. He wondered whether power had ever been what he thought it was, or whether it had always been this quiet force, the discipline to restrain rather than dominate. When the convoy finally stopped at a larger facility nestled near the foothills, the generals were greeted not by interrogators but by medical officers holding charts and pens, ready to continue treatments that had begun and scheduled for the following afternoon. The idea should have terrified him. Instead, it left him with a strange, hollow unease. The Americans didn't want his life. They wanted his survival. And that, inexplicably, felt heavier than any threat. The lantern dimmed as night deepened. Outside, footsteps approached, followed by the soft rustle of papers. An American lieutenant stepped into the barracks, scanning the room before speaking. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we'll begin transferring some of you to secondary facilities for long-term care. Your names will be posted at sunrise." He paused at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the cold glow outside. "Some of you," he added, "will be moved farther south." He left without explanation, but the words settled like a chill across the room. Farther south. None of the generals knew what that meant. But they understood instinctively that whatever awaited them next would challenge them even more deeply than the care they had already received, and perhaps expose truths they were not yet prepared to confront. Dawn crept over the camp with a muted gold that softened the edges of the barbed wire, casting long shadows that stretched like unanswered questions across the ground. General Forster awoke to the faint ache in his leg, now cleanly bandaged after the surgery he had dreaded but survived, and felt an unexpected clarity settle in the quiet of his thoughts. He had expected pain, humiliation, or at least triumphant disdain from the enemy. What he received instead was competence, and that contrast gnawed more deeply than any wound. Around him, the barracks stirred as the other generals rose slowly, each man wearing the same unsettled expression, as though they had all woken from the same dream they feared to interpret. Reinhardt flexed his first camp. Mers felt a peculiar relief as he stepped down from the truck, accompanied by a guilt he could not articulate. It was the guilt of a man being treated better than he believed he deserved. Inside the new infirmary, Forster was shown an X-ray of his leg, the dark shard of metal that had been removed now a ghostly shape behind glass, and he realized he was looking at the first physical proof that the Americans intended him to live. Reinhardt, standing beside him, exhaled slowly as though releasing years of rigid certainty, and murmured that perhaps survival was not the enemy he had imagined. The day ended with the generals settled into new quarters, quieter and cleaner than the last, yet the silence between them felt heavier, filled with unasked questions about the ideology that had shaped their lives. As night gathered, Forster sat awake, now realizing that compassion from the enemy demanded a reckoning he had never prepared for. And when the door opened to reveal a chaplain beside an intelligence officer, Forster sensed that the questions ahead would test him more than pain. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.